Hello Internet. My name's Andy, I'm the creative fielder, the repo you're seeing in front of you. And today I'm going to give you a quick rundown on Fielder, which is a React form library which uses a different approach to most popular libraries such as Formic, in the sense that it's a field-first approach to validation. So without further ado, let's create a sandbox and I'll show you how I go about making a form with Fielder. So first thing we want to do is create a sandbox. Going to go ahead and add Fielder as a dependency. Okay. And now we want to create our form component. Import React. Import Fielder. Okay. All right, so we've got our form component ready, and there's two things that our root level component we're about to make is going to do. So every form is going to have a root component, which is where the state resides. So that's the first responsibility. And the second responsibility is to compose the input elements of your form. So that might be some kind of routing, that might be just presenting the content, and also exposing that aforementioned state to those components. So the way in which we do this is we would make our component, and we're going to create our form state first. So we just call useForm. UseForm doesn't take any arguments at the moment. That's because we're using field level validation. So the thing to remember here is that anything such as validation, initial values, any of that stuff, we don't declare that on a form-wide scope. That is specific to each field. So we've created our state. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our provider. Or we're going to expose our instantiate our provider. So we're going to go to fielder provider. And the value of that, form state. Sweet. So we've just made a component which creates some state and exposes it via context, but it doesn't have any content yet. So let's go ahead and do that. For this example, I'm going to make a login form. So super basic. Let's do a div here. We're going to have some input, which is type text. And then we're also going to have some import of type password. Ooh. Put that form content in there. Like so. Hit save. Let's export the form. And let's just stick this in our app and see what that looks like to start with. Okay. And boom. Just like that. We've got some form elements and we can type in them, and obviously they're uncontrolled at the moment. So we need to find a way to hook those into our form state that we declared earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our form component, and now we need to find a way of communicating that these fields have been mounted. So the way in which we do that is we call useField. We're going to pass the name of the field, which is going to be the username for the first component. Initial value if we want to. Let's go for user. And that's our way of telling our form, which we declared earlier, that the field is mounted and it has an initial value. Like I said, you're always going to mount your fields using useField. You're never going to have to declare up front anything such as fields or validation, because all that can be completely dynamic based on your form content. If you have 3 different form contents which are conditional, then you can do that. You don't need to worry about having to mess around at the top level with your state. If useField mounts, the field will mount. If it doesn't mount, the field won't mount. So now we've got that over and done with. We just need to now hook that declaration into our input elements. So we're going to have a username props and some metadata. And all we got to do now is spread those props into our input element. And straight away you can see that initial value is being set. So username props is return from use field, and it returns, it's an object containing the value of the field, but also some change handlers, some blur handlers, and things of that nature. Sets the name attribute of the input element, all that jazz. So now basically that's the full end-to-end section of getting a field hooked up with some state in a form. That's all we got to do. And if we want to do the same for the password, we can go here, password props, password metadata. Let's just have an empty password. And same again. Spread that in. And there we go. We now have two control components, which sets an initial value when the field mounts. Jobs are good. So when you get to this point, you're probably thinking, okay, that's great, but I need to do some validation. Most forms have validation, right? We want to make sure the username exists, for example. So how do we do that? Well, the way in which we do that is first we need a validation function, right? So a validation function, super simple, takes a value and throws an error if it doesn't like what it sees. So in our case, we probably want to say if there's no value, let's throw a tantrum and say username is required. And we can also go ahead and say if the username has a length of less than, let's say less than 5, let's also throw an error and say username must be at least 5 characters. Boom. Okay. So we made our validation function. You can go ahead and use yup or whatever you want. In this case, I found that it's a lot simpler just to make some functions like this. But either way, however you want to do it, all you got to do then is take your function, pass it to the validate prop on your field, and you now have validation. So you're probably wondering why you can't see any validation right now. And that's because we haven't hooked it up to the view. But if we console log this, the metadata that we get from the field, you'll see that we start to get a bunch of information, such as whether the field is valid, is it currently being validated, has it blurred, has it changed, and also error. So what you'll see is, as we start to get rid of stuff, we start to get new errors. If we make this longer than 5 characters, no errors. If we make it empty, we get that error, username is required. So you can see that we are actually getting that information about the validation of the field. We're just not presenting it. So the easiest way to do something like that, to present it, I found, is to do something like username meta.error. So if we have an error, let's go ahead and print that. There we go. Sweet. So we get an error when the field is empty, or if it's less than 5 characters. If it's more than 5 characters, we're good. Obviously, you can add your own styling. You can make this as pretty or as ugly as you want. But that's the fundamentals of validation. Okay. So we've now got fields which are hooked into our form state. We've got those fields having their values controlled and also validated. The only thing left to do now is to have some kind of submission logic. So this is when you want to put it inside you. No, I'm kidding. You don't want to put it inside use form. Said a couple of times already. Use form doesn't take any arguments right now because there's just no need. So again, if you conditionally render your form content, you might have different submission logic. And we don't want that to be coupled to the form. We want that to be coupled to the point in time that the user is clicking the button. So the way this works in Fielder is you create your handle submit function, anywhere you want, whatever makes the most sense. I found that the most sense is to put it where your submit button is. So in this case, we'll have a handle submit. We're going to log, let's log the full state of the form, which in order to do that and to prevent prop drilling, we're going to import that from use form context. And we're going to print the fields. Okay, so we got submission logic. Just going to go ahead and add a button. Submit. Sweet. And then what we'll see is if we type some values, check the console, hit submit. See now that we get username with an object that has all the information about that field, but most importantly, the value of that field and the value of the password field. So the final thing you might want to do is somehow enforce that your validation is complied to before you allow submitting. And that's a very common use case for any form. Why would you have validation if it's optional, right? So the way we enforce that is while we can see if individual fields are valid, with Fielder, what it will do is it will take the valid state of all the fields that are currently mounted and give you an isValid, which is are all the fields in the form which are currently mounted, are they valid? So in this case, we can just set disabled is equal to not isValid. Now what you'll see is, just going to give that a quick refresh. Start with our initial value. We get some validation, and you can see that the button is now, can't click it. I'm clicking away, no dice. But if we have a valid form, we're good to go. We can hit submit, and then we get to our submit handler. And that is how you use Fielder. So if you've got any questions about how to use this, maybe some of your use cases, take a look at the docs, reach out, ask some questions on the repo, and get involved. This is designed to work with really dynamic forms. So the more dynamic your fields are, if you've got fields which are conditionally rendered, you've got validation logic, which is conditional on other fields, this is definitely the library to go. Take a look. We've got some strong examples as well of things like branching form logic and conditional rendering and things like that. So take a look, and hope you enjoy it.